At the Las Vegas Convention Center in the winter of 1982, beneath the high cathedral ceiling of an exhibition hall, 3,000 seats had been filled to the back wall. The crowd moved through the aisles in that particular way of crowds that know they are gathering to witness something that matters. Not hurried, not casual, but drawn by an invisible wire. The air held the specific quality of anticipation that arrives only when two forms of excellence have agreed to collide. Don Wilson was 28 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, 190 pounds of dense, conditioned muscle shaped by a decade spent inside American kickboxing gyms and Japanese tournament rings. His record was 47 wins, 3 losses. His title was legitimate, the professional middleweight karate champion, undefeated in title defenses for 2 consecutive years. His hands were known to move in combinations that broke the interval between thought and impact, a 3-punch sequence that martial artists in both coasts had begun to call, without affection, the Dragon's sequence. Because it came fast, and it came hard, and once it began, there was no negotiating with it. He carried himself with the certainty of a man who had tested his skill against the best available opposition and walked away. He had come to the convention center that day wearing a crimson gi, his name stitched across the shoulders in gold thread. And there was no ambiguity in what his presence communicated. He was the standard by which other fighters in that room would be measured. The stage had been erected in the center of the hall, a simple raised platform no more than 4 feet high, surrounded on 3 sides by the crowd. Overhead, the lights, not the theatrical lights of television production, but the flat, business-like fluorescence of a municipal exhibition space, cast a light without shadow, a light that refused to dramatize. In the third row, wearing a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a pair of worn canvas shoes, sat a man who was now 63 years old. He was not tall, he was not heavy, he wore no insignia, no belt, no gi bearing his name. If you had walked past him in that moment, you would have assumed he was someone's grandfather attending out of obligation. His hair was beginning its transition to silver. His hands were relaxed in his lap. He was watching Don Wilson with the specific attention of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to see what other people could not. In the next 4 seconds, in front of 3,200 trained observers, the mathematics of one man's certainty were about to be revised by the mathematics of another man's patience. And in that revision lay a story that would be carried through every martial arts gymnasium in the American West by evening, transmitted through telephone lines by midnight, and would still be told, in incrementally altered form, 50 years later. Nobody in that convention hall knew they were about to witness the precise moment when the narrative of American karate was about to turn. Don Wilson's rise through the ranks of professional kickboxing had been methodical. He had begun in the American karate circuit, the tournament side, the competition side, where points were awarded for landing clean strikes on padded target areas, where protective equipment transformed violence into a kind of choreographed mathematics. But the sport had become too small for him. In 1975, he had made the decision that would define his reputation. He had crossed over into full-contact American kickboxing, the sport where head blows were permitted, and where the standing 8 count replaced the polite pause. It was in that crucible that he had earned his title. The Dragon was not a nickname awarded to him, it was a name he had acquired through the simple machinery of competitive sport. He had entered the ring 47 times. 47 times, he had imposed his will. 47 times, his technique and his conditioning and his absolute willingness to press forward through pain and fatigue had been sufficient. In the world of professional martial sports, that record was the only autobiography that mattered. But there was a particular form of certainty that arrived in athletes who had climbed to the very top of their discipline. It was not mere confidence. Confidence could be shaken, certainty was different. Certainty was the assumption, so thoroughly internalized that it had become invisible, that the opponent across from him would be subject to the same physics, the same pain, the same capacity for error that he had observed in every competitor he had ever faced. Certainty assumed a kind of monotony to human capacity. That was Don Wilson's invisible wound, not weakness, but an inability to imagine that human excellence could wear a form different from the one he had perfected. unexpected. He had been brought to Las Vegas that day by the promoters of the exhibition, men who saw in a matchup between the reigning middleweight karate champion and the man they were calling the greatest karate master of the modern era, the kind of event that would draw both the hardcore competition crowd and the general public. Chuck Norris in 1982 was neither unknown nor invisible. His tournaments had been won decades earlier, but he had spent the 15 years since then constructing something far more valuable, a public mythology. He had appeared on television, in commercials, in the first stirrings of a film career. He had become the face of American karate at precisely the moment when American karate was learning how to sell itself to people who had never entered a dojo. But the physical man, the actual body, had not been on public display in any consequential way for some years. There was always the possibility, in those intervals between public appearances, that the physical being had diminished, that the body had softened, that age had begun the inevitable work of subtraction. It was this possibility, not stated but understood, that had given the exhibition its energy. What would happen when the aging icon returned to the platform and stood across from the modern champion? The microphone had been placed at the edge of the stage, angled toward the crowd. After the opening displays, the board breaking, the demonstration kicks, the ritualistic elements of a martial arts exhibition, Don Wilson had been handed the microphone. The crowd had quieted. There was something about the simple fact of the microphone that changed the tenor of the event. A demonstration was one thing, but a man speaking into a microphone addressing a crowd directly was making a different kind of statement. He was moving from the realm of physical display into the realm of words, of narrative, of claim. Don Wilson spoke with the straightforward clarity of a man accustomed to public address. His voice was calm and without theatrical affect. He said that he had tremendous respect for the lineage of American karate, that he understood the historical importance of the men who had built the foundation upon which competitors like himself now stood. He said this with the warmth of someone paying tribute. And then he said something different. He said that the state of karate had moved beyond what it had been in previous generations, that the sport had evolved, that full contact competition had revealed certain truths about what worked and what did not work when a trained fighter faced an opponent who was not constrained by points, not padded by equipment, but simply fighting. He said that exhibition karate, the traditional form, the form that had been the lifeblood of American martial arts for the previous 2 decades, was a beautiful thing, a cultural treasure. But that it was not, in any practical sense, fighting. He said this while looking directly at the man he understood would take the stage across from him. He said, "Your karate is beautiful, but it is not real." The specific silence that followed was the silence of a crowd that had understood, suddenly, that the event they had come to witness had shifted. It was no longer a demonstration, it was a test. When Chuck Norris rose from his seat in the 3rd row, he did not rise quickly. He moved with a particular kind of deliberation, a slowness that had nothing to do with age or infirmity and everything to do with a complete absence of hurry. He stood. He remained standing for a moment without moving, his hands at his sides, his eyes on the stage and the man occupying it. He did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not signal in any way that he understood what had just been said. He simply stood there, in his work shirt and canvas shoes. And the recognition began. It started in the 3rd row, where those closest to him understood first. And then it moved outward, like a current advancing across water. Like a wave that has begun at a point of impact and radiates outward until it has encompassed everything in its reach. 3,200 people began to understand, in that moment, that the man in the gray work shirt was Chuck Norris. That the exhibition was no longer an exhibition, that what they had understood as a staged event had become something else entirely. He walked toward the stage with that same absence of hurry. When he reached the bottom of the platform, he did not use the stairs. He placed one hand on the edge of the platform, and, in a single smooth motion, pulled himself onto it. It was a small gesture. It was the gesture of a man for whom physical effort had become a language of its own. Once on the stage, he removed his work shirt. The motion was economical. He folded it once along its length and then folded it again. He set the folded bundle down on the corner of the stage, near where his shoes would eventually rest. Then he folded his shoes off, pressed his feet against the surface of the platform, and waited. This was the moment that every fighter in that crowd understood, and that every fighter watching the recording in the years that would follow understood. He has already lost, he does not yet know it. But the outcome is already written. A fight between two men is not a simple collision of force against force. It is a negotiation about distance. It is an argument about timing. It is a conversation about who controls the space between two bodies and what can be accomplished in that control. This understanding separates the man who throws strikes from the man who has spent a lifetime studying what happens in the precise milliseconds before, during, and after a strike is thrown. Don Wilson's first response was instinctive. He pressed forward, as he had done 47 times before, with the assumption that motion and pressure and the aggressive advancement of his body would force his opponent into a defensive posture. His hands began to move in that precise sequence that had earned him his title: fast combinations. The specific choreography of technique that had worked against every opponent who had faced it. Second one. Don Wilson's right hand extended in the opening movement of a jab. The intention was to establish range, to press forward, to move Chuck Norris back. But the hand meant nothing. Chuck Norris had not moved backward. He had moved laterally, sliding his body 6 inches to the right with a motion so minimal that the crowd had to watch his eyes to understand that anything had changed. The jab passed through empty space. In the corner of the platform, the tournament director's hands had come to rest flat on the table in front of him. His eyes were still moving, tracking the motion, trying to understand what was occurring. Second two. Don Wilson's follow-up strike arrived, a natural progression from the missed jab. A front kick that should have closed the distance and forced compliance. It was a kick that had landed thousands of times on thousands of competitors who had done the same thing Don Wilson was now doing, which was to attack the space where the opponent had been, rather than where the opponent was. Chuck Norris stepped forward and to the left, and the kick moved through air. There was a coffee cup on a small table at the edge of the platform, set there by one of the event organizers. A stunt coordinator who had been brought to the event as a technical observer set it down deliberately, the sound of the ceramic base, connecting with the wood surface sharp enough to carry through the hall. Second three. Don Wilson felt, perhaps for the first time in years, the sensation of missing, of throwing with full commitment and finding nothing to hit. The natural response was to reset, to gather his feet beneath him, to recalibrate his distance estimation, but there was no time for recalibration. Before his front kick had fully retracted, before his weight had fully settled onto his rear leg, there came a motion from the man standing across from him that the crowd could barely track. It was a spinning back kick, rotating roughly 360 degrees. The ball of the foot moving through the space between them at a velocity that seemed to accelerate as it traveled. Don Wilson raised his hands to defend. His years of training and competition rose up in his body as pure reflex. His hands were positioned correctly, his elbows were tucked. He had defended against spinning kicks before. The ball of Chuck Norris's foot stopped exactly 1 inch from the center of Don Wilson's chest. What happened in that instant was not a battle. What happened was a translation. What happened was the communication, without words, of a fundamental truth that Don Wilson had organized his entire understanding of martial combat around avoiding. The distance. The control. The ability to generate velocity that could demolish but chose, at the final instant, to withhold. The silence that followed was complete. It was the silence that arrives when 3,200 people inhale at the same moment and have not yet decided whether to exhale. Don Wilson stepped backward. His hands were still raised. His breathing had not yet recovered from the exertion. He looked at the man standing across from him with an expression that was undergoing, in real time, the specific work of revision. Every assumption that had carried him through 47 competitive victories was in the process of being unmade. Chuck Norris did not press the advantage. He did not close the distance. He did not throw another strike. He simply stood there, barefoot on the platform, and waited. The waiting itself was a form of teaching. When Don Wilson understood, without any remaining doubt, that the outcome was no longer a question to be settled through combat but a fact that had already been established through something that had nothing to do with the accumulation of strikes or points or competitive victories, he lowered his hands. Chuck Norris extended his hand. Don Wilson took it. The two men stood for a moment in that configuration, hand joined to hand, and then Chuck Norris leaned forward. He spoke to Don Wilson with a quiet voice that reached only the man standing in front of him. What he said, in that moment, was not recorded. Don Wilson heard it. The stunt coordinator heard it. The tournament director heard it. Everyone else, the 3,100 people in the crowd, the millions who would watch the recording in the decades that followed, never knew. The private sentence lived in Don Wilson's silence afterward. It lived in the way he bowed, not a gesture of submission, but a gesture that carried something closer to understanding. It lived in his choice in the moment that followed, to turn to the crowd and, without excuse or equivocation, to nod. To acknowledge what had occurred. To refuse the narrative of deflection, and instead to stand in the simple, difficult truth of what he had witnessed. The story carried outward from the Las Vegas Convention Center like a wave through a medium. The fighters who had been in attendance went back to their dojos, to their gyms, to their tournaments. They told the story. It mutated as it traveled. In one telling, Don Wilson had been knocked unconscious. In another, the kick had landed and had cracked 4 ribs. In another, Don Wilson had refused to shake Chuck Norris's hand. In another, the confrontation had lasted 3 full minutes, an epic exchange of technique and counter-technique. The story was retold and transformed, and with each retelling, it accumulated details that had never occurred and shed details that had. This is what oral history does. This is how a moment, 4 seconds in story time, the time of physical fact, becomes, in the retelling, a saga that can be expanded or compressed depending on the needs of the narrator. But a certain kernel remained constant through all the iterations. It was this. A man who had organized his entire life around the pursuit of one form of excellence had stood across from another man who had organized his life around a different form of excellence. And in the moment of collision, the difference between those two forms had become visible. Not as judgment, not as hierarchy, but as a simple fact of physics and will and the particular shape that mastery assumes when it has been pursued with a specific kind of dedication. Don Wilson never spoke publicly about what Chuck Norris had said to him in that moment. He continued his career in competitive fighting. He continued to win, but something had shifted in his understanding. In the interviews he gave in the years that followed, speaking about martial arts and competition and what it meant to be a fighter, there was a different quality, not humiliation, but an openness to the possibility that excellence could wear many forms, and that the form he had chosen, the form of competition and victory and the accumulation of points and titles, was not the only form it could take. Chuck Norris never spoke about the exhibition as a conflict. When he referred to it, in the rare interviews where he did refer to it, he described Don Wilson with respect and without diminishment. He praised the younger man's technique, his speed, his conditioning. He refused the temptation to position the moment as a confirmation of his superiority. He positioned it, instead, as a moment where two different approaches to the same art had met, and each had learned something. The specific truth of that moment, viewed across the distance of 40 years, carries a lesson that has nothing to do with fighting. It is this: the forms that excellence assumes are determined not by the quality of the effort, but by the direction of the effort. The man who pursues the form of winning, the trophy, the title, the victory over an opponent, will find that form, and will find it reliably. The man who pursues the form of mastery, the understanding that lives beneath the execution, the ability to do and not to do, the control that can stop at the edge of destruction, will find that form as well. But they are not the same form. And a person can spend an entire life in pursuit of one without ever understanding what the other form looks like until the moment when they stand across from someone who has spent an entire life living it. This is a lesson for anyone who has organized their life around becoming very good at one particular thing. It is a reminder that the path you have chosen to walk and the excellence you have achieved along that path are both real and both worthy. But it is also a recognition of the possibility that outside of your path, on roads you have never traveled, other forms of excellence are being built by people who are dedicating themselves with the same intensity that you have dedicated yourself. And that the moment when those two forms of excellence collide is not a moment of victory or defeat. It is a moment of vision. Next week, we will talk about the time a world-class martial artist was asked to teach a technique to a group of students, only to discover that one particular student was not a student at all, but a test. Make sure you are subscribed.